Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeremy Barmay, Professor of Chinese History here in the College of Asia and the Pacific. First, I'd like to say that we acknowledge the first Australians on whose land we meet today and whose cultures, which are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history, we celebrate. It is, I can really say, an unalloyed pleasure to represent the George E. Morrison Lecture Series Committee, that is my colleagues John Minford, John Unger and myself, in welcoming you here to this, the 70th George E. Morrison Lecture. This is a lecture that will be presented by Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister of Australia and an ANU old boy. The last time that our community of China scholars met in this place was to remember in sorrow, yet also to celebrate our mentor and friend, Professor Liu Cunren. Professor Liu was a man of outstanding erudition and profound humility. He influenced all who studied under him. One of his students was Kevin Rudd. And Kevin was kind enough to send a personal message to be read at that memorial ceremony last year. But before we proceed today, I would also like to say we are meeting in a cloud of sorrow as well. After all, China has just marked a national day of mourning for those who tragically lost their lives as a result of the Jiegu earthquake in Qinghai, northwest China. It's strange because I first met Kevin at the time of another national Chinese tragedy. In 1976, I was a student in China back on holiday, and I was asked by Professor Liu to give a lecture to the Chinese class that he was teaching. It was just before the Tangshan earthquake of 1976 that saw the death of tens of thousands of Chinese people. I was on holidays from Shenyang and stayed in Australia for a while because I couldn't go back to China. I gave that guest lecture in Chinese studies at the invitation of Professor Liu, as I said. I was 22, and it was the first time I'd ever given a lecture. It was quite terrifying. At the end of it, this sort of shiny-eyed young man came up and presented himself, said his name was Kevin Rudd, and had a chat. Little did I know that a mere 34 years later, I would be sitting being lectured by him. Sic tempus, sic mores, as they say. But the China of the past, when the Tangshan earthquake devastated northeast China with a massive loss of life, was like a China of a different world, a different era. It wasn't reported. Tens of thousands died in agony without help, and China at that time was very much a sealed country. Now China is far changed and open to the world. And that China and the changes since then are of pressing relevance to us and of great interest to audiences of the Morrison Lectures, who have been joining us every year for many years indeed. This is a lecture that traditionally lasts 1 hour, and since I've already been blathering on for some minutes, I shall cut my comments short and welcome you here and invite the Vice-Chancellor of the ANU, Ian Chubb, to say a few words and to welcome the Prime Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Prime Minister, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ANU colleagues, of course all of whom are also distinguished guests. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you here today. Prime Minister, it's always a pleasure to welcome you to our campus. Prime Minister, old boy, not just because you're an old boy, but it's always a pleasure to have you here amongst us. And it's a particular pleasure today to welcome you here to address us in the form of the George E. Morrison Lecture. The topic, Australia and China and the world, is particularly relevant because, as we all know, China and its growing role and influence in the world is of real and tangible importance to Australia and to all Australians. It is, of course, important to the rest of the world as well. It's also important to us at ANU. It's important, apart from the obvious reasons, the significance of China, but it's important in a symbolic and very significant way. Work on the Asia-Pacific region, including obviously work on China and with colleagues in China, has long been a focus, been a feature at ANU. And the urgent need for focused work on our region was a major driver behind the establishment of the ANU in 1946. One of the great roles of universities in our society, in our societies, is to study the matters that influence the way the world works and to help inform the responses that we make. It's through education that we enlighten, and through research that we know how to enlighten and what to use to enlighten. But it's sometimes hard. An easy option is for us all to keep our eyes closed and dream of the world as we would like it to be. But when we open our eyes and see the world as it really is, we need then to open our minds and learn and understand and use learning and understanding to develop relations between us that secure a future for us all, wherever it is that we may live and whatever country it is that we may call home. Universities are one of the places that civilised nations invest in to help that understanding and discovery through careful analysis, robust but always civilised discussions, and as best we can in a disinterested pursuit of the truth. So universities are important, and of course ANU is particularly important. This lecture series is also one of the things about which our university can be proud. It has a venerable history. Indeed, it moved to the ANU at the time that our institution was founded. And today, Prime Minister, as Jeremy just remarked, you're presenting the 70th Morrison Lecture. Morrison Lecture Series was founded in 1932 by Chinese residents in Australia, and it was, in their words, and I quote, to honour for all time the great Australian who rendered valuable service to China. It was also hoped that the lectures would contribute to the cultural relations and understanding between the two countries at a time of heightened international tension and deep suspicion. This annual event was interrupted by the outbreak of the Pacific War in 1942, and the Morrison Lecture Series might never have been heard of again but for two fortuitous happenings: the founding of a national university in Australia and the advent of Sir Douglas Berry Copeland. This New Zealand-born economist, academic and civil servant, upon completing his assignment as Australia's first post-war ambassador to China, was called upon to assume the foundation vice-chancellorship of the new National University. So Copeland was responsible for reviving the Morrison Lecture. The first address he gave in 1948 marked the refoundation of this series of lectures, sponsored from then on by the ANU itself. And it was an important moment in our university's history, and today marks another important moment in our history as the national university of this country. The founders of this university wanted ANU to, and I quote, take its rightful place among the great universities of the world and to play an important role in aligning Australia with the great and enlightened nations of the world. This role has been enhanced in particular by the ANU's widely recognised expertise in the history, culture, governance, interests of the countries of the Asia-Pacific region, including China. Our research and teaching on China serves as an important national resource. It helps to build bridges between academics and policy makers and the broader Australian and international communities, which in turn fosters trusted networks that benefit our nation. Promoting open intellectual exchanges, innovation and creativity in the study of China will, in keeping with the spirit of the founders of the Morrison Lecture, contribute to greater understanding between our two countries. So for all those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me great pleasure to invite the Prime Minister of Australia to address us.
Thank you very much. Professor Ian Chubb, members of the Morrison Committee, Professors Jeremy Barmay, John Minford and Jonathan Unger, Professor Andrew McIntyre, Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, Dr. Richard Rigby, Executive Director of the China Institute, my Cabinet colleague and good friend, Senator Kim Carr, the Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science, and other colleagues, one and all. Dennis Richardson, Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, members of the Diplomatic Corps, faculty, staff and students of the Australian National University, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'd begin also by acknowledging those who have lost their lives or have been injured in the recent earthquakes in Qinghai. China, it seems, in recent times has been dealt an unfair hand with natural disasters. The earthquakes in Sichuan were of an extraordinary degree of destruction. While this one in Qinghai is a much lesser order of magnitude, it reminds us all of our common humanity when nature strikes, and strikes so severely. Our thoughts are with our friends in China and those particularly in Qinghai as they wrestle with this natural disaster. Last year, I had the privilege of spending time with Alistair Morrison, not long before his death. Alistair was 93 years old, the last surviving son of Morrison of Peking, after whom this significant lecture is named. It was a singular privilege for me to have spent just a little time with Alistair's family memories, sharing them. A unique human connection linking the tumultuous events of the late Qing Empire to the rise of modern China. For students of history, the world of Morrison's Peking seems now exotic and remote, whereas in truth, we are separated from that world by the span of just one lifetime, albeit, in Alistair's case, a very long and well-lived life. Alistair, in fact, asked if I would deliver a Morrison lecture. I said to him it would be an honour to do so. And so today I'm delighted to be able to present this, the 70th George E. Morrison Lecture. George Morrison was a man surrounded by controversy, but no one, not even his greatest detractors, could deny his deep knowledge of China and his fascination with this ancient and continuing civilization. Morrison was one of a kind. Nonetheless, the truth is he is little known in contemporary Australia. My view is that 90 years after his death, it is time for that to change. Morrison is one of the most remarkable Australians in our early national history to enliven the world stage. And it is fitting that he is remembered by this, one of the earliest and oldest lecture series in this very young country of ours. Throughout its long history, this lecture series has addressed many aspects of China's past and its present. In recent years, presenters have wrestled with what has now become one of the truly great questions of our age, our contemporary age, the re-emergence, the rise and the future global role of modern China. C.P. Fitzgerald, the noted historian of China who established what was then the Department of Far Eastern History at the Australian National University, wrote of Morrison in the following terms: a man of unusual percipience and thus freer than many of his contemporaries from the prevailing dominant ideas. He almost alone could see beneath the dry bones of the dying Manchu Empire the stirrings of fresh life, of a new, probably unintelligible, and almost certainly disconcerting China, but yet a continuation of the life of that great nation into a new period of vigorous activity. In 1935, delivering only the fifth Morrison lecture, the noted physician Wu Liande, a Malay of Chinese descent, remarked that in the person of Morrison there was a blending of qualities seldom encountered in a single individual: a physician, a journalist, a traveller, an author, a book collector, and a humanist, all combined. In his travels, his sense of adventure, his curiosity for understanding and knowledge, George E. Morrison was an Australian one-off. He travelled relentlessly. Between his school and university studies, he walked from Geelong to Adelaide. At the age of 20, he trekked from Normanton in Queensland, just south of the Gulf of Carpentaria, all the way to Melbourne, a journey of almost 3,300 kilometres, covered without horse or camel. Besides his travels to China, Morrison ventured deep into New Guinea, studied medicine in Scotland and travelled widely in the United States, in the West Indies and in Morocco. He came close to death on many occasions and even had the rare honour of reading his own obituary in the Times, after erroneous reporting of him being killed during the Boxer uprising. Morrison's curiosity and acute skills of observation helped make him a masterful writer. His talents were reflected in his book of 1895, An Australian in China, simply titled. A book which so impressed readers in England that he was appointed in 1897 as the first permanent correspondent for the Times newspaper in Beijing. Over time, he gained prominence in China and internationally, earning the nickname Chinese Morrison or Morrison of Peking. In many ways, Morrison often placed himself in the centre of historical events and always in the centre of danger. He was in southern China to report on the epoch-making rebellion of October 1911, which brought to an end 2,000 years of dynastic rule. Back in the embattled imperial city of Peking, he landed the scoop of the millennium by reporting the abdication of the last emperor, Xuantong, or, as he was more commonly known, Puyi. He then witnessed the founding of the Republic of China, which ushered in the country's first, albeit short-lived, democratic elections, a nascent legal system, and a very boisterous, free press. As if his journalism did not bring him close enough to the action, Morrison then quit the Times to act as advisor to the second president of the Republic, Yuan Shikai, who notoriously in 1915 sought to re-establish the monarchy, proclaiming himself as the Hongxian Emperor. For the record, reflecting perhaps an early Australian taste for republicanism, Morrison cautioned his then boss against this course of action. Morrison's, in short, was a truly remarkable career. So remarkable that the street on which he lived in central Beijing, known today as Wangfujing, was known throughout the years of the Chinese Republic as Morrison Street. Morrison comes from a remarkable stable of Australian sinologues, writers, and public intellectuals. Figures like William Henry Donald, the journalist from Lithgow who became a political advisor to Sun Yat-sen and later to Chiang Kai-shek. C.P. Fitzgerald, the noted historian, academic leader and educator. Wang Gungwu, historian of the Chinese diaspora, former head of this school, and then later Vice-Chancellor of the University of Hong Kong. Liu Chunyan, of recent memory, preeminent scholar of Confucianism, Taoism and Buddhism, and former head of the Department of Chinese. Pierre Ryckmans, the much-awarded art historian, novelist and essayist. Ken Gardner, great expert in the Chinese classics and early Chinese classical history. Stephen Fitzgerald, the historian, public advocate for the closer Australian engagement with Asia, and a man who became, of course, our first ambassador to the People's Republic of China. Ross Garnaut, economist, prime ministerial advisor, and later himself ambassador to China. Professor Jeremy Barmay, academic filmmaker and writer whose particular understanding of China's past and its possible futures is recognised internationally, and many more as well. What unites all of these figures is more than a deep knowledge of China. They also bring, often from different political perspectives, a passionate, sympathetic, but nonetheless clear-eyed analysis of the China of their time. In doing so, they have brought a certain Australian objectivity to the task, an independence of approach, an understanding that acknowledges the rich legacies of our Western origins, but one admixed with a fascination for the ancient civilizations of our region and their modern permutations. This Australian objectivity seeks therefore to be informed, understanding, and always quizzical, tempered by what we could call common sense, tempered also by a wry awareness of our own place in the region and the world, and of course our own sense of humour, although a sense of humour that is sometimes inexplicable to cultures other than our own. We see this Australian tradition in the brilliant career of C.P. Fitzgerald himself. British by birth, Australian by choice. Fitzgerald was passionate about understanding China and communicating that knowledge to a broader public. In his highly readable book, Why China?, published in 1985, and which I recall reading as a young diplomat posted in Beijing at the time, C.P. dates his interest in China to the year 1917, when as a young man he read 2 articles in the Times by George E. Morrison. As Fitzgerald recalled, here was a vast world of fascinating history, of which I knew nothing whatsoever. It did not enter into the school curriculum at all. He then adds in brackets, a strong point in its favour, close brackets. He went on to work in China, and he soon set to learning Mandarin and classical Chinese. Fitzgerald was deeply aware that a knowledge of contemporary China had to be grounded in the understanding of the histories, the literature, and the philosophies of the past. In his long career, he wrote on China's dynastic past and its modern revolution. On the fall of the nationalists, on the rise of the communists. He also wrote extensively on China's importance to the future of our own region. Through his tireless public service as an educator and communicator, he reached out to Australians at large, sharing his vast learning on China's history and its future. After he came to Australia to work at the Australian National University, Fitzgerald would develop a deep interest in both the Australian national identity and how that identity shapes our own engagement with China. In particular, he supported this country pursuing its own interests in relationship with China in ways free of those of the United Kingdom and the United States. Like other students of the Chinese world, C.P. Fitzgerald knew how China had for centuries loomed large in the Western mind. Hopes and fears, fantasies and nightmares were all readily projected on a land that for so long was regarded as an exotic Far East. Whereas for us in Australia, China represented a much more immediate and practical reality to our nearer north. In some respects, CP was pointing to the essential ingredients of a particular Australian perspective on China, a perspective grounded in a knowledge of China's past, a practical appreciation of its present, and an informed hope for the future. His view of China was neither captured by arid ideology, nor a view that China was somehow simply a case study of some sort of cultural or political exotica. For people like George E. Morrison, C.P. Fitzgerald and Stephen Fitzgerald, and others, China was never a canvas on which the West could simply cast its own feverish imaginings, either utopian or apocalyptic. It was always a vital, complex and powerful reality with which they became passionately involved. Theirs is a genuine passion grounded in learning, cautious in approach, yet always mitigated by empathy. China's view of its own role in the world is equally a complex mixture of hopes and concerns. Its history, dynastic, republican and contemporary, informs its own re-emergent role. Some say China's sense of its own history in fact emboldens its sense of future mission. Others would argue that these deep historical legacies do exactly the reverse, that they call for measured caution on the part of China's contemporary leadership, given the litany of miscalculations littered across China's past. Either way, most would agree that China's historiography is one of abiding political and foreign policy relevance. History in China is not just academic. How China views its history very much shapes how China views its future. For China, next year will see a seminal anniversary in the nation's most fraught modern history. 2011 marks the 100th anniversary of the end of the Chinese Empire and the beginning of the Chinese Republic. Between now and October next year, we will see a flurry of Chinese commentaries, both official and otherwise, on the significance of the Xinhai Revolution of 1911 and China's trajectory since that time. The Xinhai Revolution was a turning point in the history of Asia. It was the first major revolution in the region, hailed by Lenin as, quote, the awakening of Asia, unquote. It created the first democratic republic in North Asia, emboldening movements for reform and self-determination that would later sweep the region. For China, it marked a break with dynastic autocracy and colonialism, initiating what some historians called an age of openness. It is also significant today as an event that will be celebrated in fraternal amity on both sides of the Taiwan Straits. 2011 is also the 150th anniversary of the first concerted efforts by the Chinese government to become active in international affairs and to reform and to strengthen itself. This occurred with the Tongzhi Restoration in 1861, aimed at reversing the fortunes of a dynasty beset by aggressive Western powers during the Opium Wars on the one hand, and internal rebellion through the Taiping Rebellion on the other. This was a period of unprecedented change. Some historians argue that the long evolution of China's reform era should in fact be dated from this 1861 restoration. It is then that the Chinese Empire first allowed representatives of foreign governments to reside in the capital. The first foreign ministry was established. There was a new Office of Foreign Trade. A formidable program of military modernisation was also begun. These reforms, like many subsequent efforts in both the Qing and the Republic of China, were thwarted by foreign incursion and local strife. Chinese thinkers and writers like Gongzi Zhen, who lived in the period 1792 to 1841, had hoped for years for change. Gongzi Zhen famously wrote the following lines: "I urge the Lord of Heaven to shake us up anew, grant us human talent, not bound to a single kind." Or, 我劝天公重斗走，不拘一格将人才. I've observed elsewhere that despite this long evolution of reform and foreign engagement, it nonetheless remains unclear how a re-emergent China will in fact set its course as a major global power and how its role will shape the future international order. Nor is it clear what new goals, national, social and personal, the Chinese people will set for themselves as a confident and prosperous modern member of the international community. What is without doubt is the fact that we are in a period of extraordinary change. We can now with clarity look back to the 18th century, to the height of China's wealth and power during the reign of the Emperor Qianlong. We can contemplate the humiliations visited upon the Manchu government during the empire's decline in the 19th century, and we too can now see that with clarity. We can appreciate the efforts of the Republican revolutionaries who established China's first democracy and who created an earlier age of openness. We are mindful too of the impact of cruel invasion, of internecine conflict, and the economic chaos that brought this era to an end. We can also understand better the trajectory of the 60 years of the People's Republic, its trials, its tribulations, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, followed by the era of stability and reform, and the historical lessons learnt from each that have brought China to where it is today. I've mentioned two commemorations that will be marked in 2011. But this year of 2010 also marks a major moment in China's past that will be recalled more painfully across the Chinese commentariat. In October of 2010, both in China and abroad, people will mark the destruction in 1860 of the Garden of Perfect Brightness, the Yuanmingyuan, and the garden palaces at the foot of the Western Hills outside Beijing. The Yuanmingyuan was the most magnificent garden palace created in imperial China. It was a seat of government as well as a museum of imperial art for over a century. An Anglo-French force destroyed it to punish the Qing government for its failure to sign a treaty at the end of the Second Opium War. The devastation of the gardens, the villas, the palaces represents a shameful low point in the interaction between China and the West. Today, the ruins of the Western palaces and the Garden of Perfect Brightness stand as China's national ruin, a sombre monument to the agonies of China's past. But those agonies were also felt by some in the West. In far-off Paris, the destruction of 1860 was decried by Victor Hugo, who wrote, "One day, two bandits entered the summer palace. One plundered, the other burned. We Europeans are the civilized ones, and for us the Chinese are the barbarians. This is what civilization has done to barbarism." So wrote Victor Hugo. The events of 1860 form a critical part of understanding China today. They represent one of the many narratives that impact on China's political and foreign policy consciousness today. But China's stories about its past are in fact made up of numerous overlapping and contrasting narratives as well. They tell of past sufferings and injustices. They speak also to our broad and common humanity. But they also express hope and the possibility of inspiring transformation, of coexistence, of cooperation, and the possibilities that lie within. We understand and appreciate China has many stories to tell, not just one. Indeed, we and the rest of the world are witnesses to, as well as interested participants in, many of these stories ourselves. In its modern nationhood, China brings together these various views of its history, its present and its future. This includes China's view of itself as a proud and ancient nation, a nation that draws upon rich and deep traditions, a nation that traces its history, its written history, back longer than any other, where the Chinese of today can draw on thousands of years of written history to understand their future place in the world. Drawing on the past, some in China today would still see their country as a victim. Others may promote it as an exemplar. Still others would point to the fact that for 150 years, China has sought to engage the West comprehensively, only to be rebuffed, exploited, and at times invaded. The question for both China and the West is which or what combination of these narratives is most likely to prevail. China is, of course, not the only one asking these questions of itself. There is great interest throughout the world as to what role China sees for itself in the future. There is a hardline view that regards China's rise as a threat to the existing global order no matter what. There is a contrary view, espoused by some principally in the developing world and a number of universities, that a new Beijing consensus should replace the Washington consensus, with China the model for developing countries to follow. There is an associated view of China as the economic saviour of the world emerging from the global financial crisis. Or alternatively, there is the view that China increasingly behaves as a mercantilist power, insensitive to its emerging global economic responsibilities. The truth is, there are as many conflicting views in the West about China and its future as there are within China itself. But within this complexity, we must recognise that there are certain core unassailable facts. The change in China since the reform and opening era began in 1978 cannot be denied. The figures tell the story. First, after 2 decades of growth of around 10% per year, China has now become the second largest economy in the world. China is now the third largest exporter of all goods and services. It is now the world's second largest car market after the United States. And on top of this, China has become the largest exporter of manufactured goods in the world. This year, in the aftermath of the worst global economic downturn since the Great Depression, China continues to be the principal engine of global economic recovery, a fact highlighted by the International Monetary Fund in recent days. Only a decade ago, this would have been unimaginable. 3 decades ago, when this process of reform began, it would have been seen as sheer fantasy. We have all been beneficiaries of China's remarkable performance. Perhaps what we do not understand so well, because we see less of it directly, is the enormous benefits this change has also brought to the people of China themselves. A second factor. Within 30 years, China has transformed itself from being an impoverished, isolated, predominantly agrarian economy to become an increasingly global, wealthy, industrial and urban-centred economy. In the process, around 500 million people have been lifted out of poverty. This is unprecedented in world history. Nearly half of China's population now live in urban centres, including around 150 cities that number more than 1 million people. China now has more internet users than the United States, including some 200 million bloggers. It has over 700 million mobile phone users. Over the past decade, outbound Chinese tourist departures have grown 5-fold to reach 47 million a year. These figures tell of a nation in a period of great change. A third factor. China's military modernisation has been rapid, as observed, for those who saw it, the 60th anniversary parade of the founding of the People's Republic. There have been profound changes too in China's foreign policy behaviour in recent times, as China's power, both real and perceived, has grown. China's transformation, therefore, across all these areas must be acknowledged. But so too must the fact that change is ongoing, and so too are its consequences. China has benefited remarkably from its policies of domestic economic reform and global economic engagement. But there is still an ongoing debate within China itself about that reform. Will it continue to unleash the creative potential of the Chinese people? Or are the urges to re-centralise control again coming into play? As some analysts argue, most recently in Foreign Affairs magazine, citing examples of how the state is now reasserting its role in the Chinese private economy. China's friends also continue to have concerns about the handling of human rights in China. We want to see the development of a truly transparent and independent legal system in China. We want to see the economic system develop in a way that brings China and the Chinese people into a globalised world economy. These facts and the question of China's future matter to us because China is now an integral part of the international system. A growing China will pursue its interests globally. That is natural. And I believe that China recognises its own fundamental interests lie in working with, not against the grain, of the international system that has served China so well in recent decades. Over the past 60 years or so, this system has entrenched the values, rules, conventions and foundations that have helped bring about the greatest prosperity that China has experienced in its history. To repeat, China has benefited enormously from this international order. Increasingly, China is also playing its part within this order. We see that in China's role in the G20. China has partnered with other major economies, including our own, in responding to the global economic crisis. China is also working with us to secure the conclusion of an ambitious WTO Doha round, which would provide a timely impetus to global growth during this difficult season. China is also engaged deeply with the nations of the Asia-Pacific region. While the region is largely at peace and on a positive trajectory, we cannot take this for granted. We need to actively shape our regional future and lay the foundations for dealing with future challenges. And I'm pleased that China too shares this goal. I shall continue to advocate the development of regional architecture that has the right membership and mandate to address the full spectrum of challenges confronting our region in the future: economic, political, and security. That membership must, of course, include China, just as it must include the United States, ASEAN at its core, and other key nations of the region: Australia, India, Japan, our friends in New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, and Russia. The inclusion of the United States and Russia in our region's emerging architecture is fundamental to the evolution of what I have called an Asia-Pacific community. In fact, so much of Australia's diplomacy has been driven by this core concern: how to integrate, in particular, the role of the United States in the future broad architecture of our region. In this context, I welcome very much the decision of ASEAN leaders at their summit in Hanoi on 8-9 April this year to encourage the United States and Russia to deepen their engagement in evolving our region's architecture. From Australia's perspective, an enhanced regional architecture involving both China and the United States is critical to our region's future and critical to China's future role within the region. While the countries of the region will need to settle how reformed regional architecture might be constituted, the ASEAN Summit outcome offers a critical step forward to the architecture our region needs for its long-term future. Beyond the region, China is also increasingly active in the United Nations system. China participated in the Copenhagen negotiations last year, and there has been much commentary on the nature of China's contribution during this critical conference on climate change. China has since associated itself with the Copenhagen Accord. But now, as the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter and commensurate with its global role and influence, China must take on a greater leadership role on climate change in the future. As an emerging power, China must take more responsibility to forge the solutions to the global challenges we face on climate change and beyond climate change. This is as necessary for China's future national interests as it is for the interests of the rest of the world. China's contribution to the world order is now undeniable. Much of it positive. But there is much, much more to be done. It does not help, for example, that China continues to associate with certain regimes around the world that others seek to isolate because of their assault on the integrity of the international system, be that Sudan or Burma. China can and should do more to support wider international efforts against destabilising regimes and on global security challenges such as Afghanistan and Iran. China is going through a period of immense change, the ramifications of which are being felt around the world. The international community shares a strong interest in maintaining a stable global order that fosters growing prosperity based on cooperation between nations. China is already a major stakeholder in the current global order. What the world would welcome is China engaging across the board as a major global stakeholder in the maintenance and enhancement of that stable, rules-based order into the future. Good for China, good also for the world. But to understand what role China will, can and must play in shaping this world order, we need to understand China more deeply and engage with China at all levels. As we enter the second decade of the 21st century, China's role in the world is now being reappraised. On the international stage, China has in many respects emerged stronger in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and the global recession, more engaged with the international community, more valued as a major force in the global economy, and more important as the world addresses the challenges of the future, most particularly climate change. Australia too must also continue to assess and reassess its own understanding of China as China's reality changes. I believe it's time for what the Australian National University's Professor Jeremy Barmay has described as a new sinology, Hou Hanxue. That is, a sinology or study of China that is mindful of the positive traditions of exchange and learning with China from the time of Matteo Ricci in the 16th century through to the time of George Morrison and C.P. Fitzgerald to the present day. A new sinology that inherits the positive legacy of understanding and engagement that enlivens so many people who were drawn to the study of China in the past. A sinology that engages with the Sinosphere and a vibrant and energetic contemporary China in all of its dimensions. As Jeremy Barmay has written, a new sinology advocates a robust engagement with contemporary China and indeed with all the Sinophone world in all of its complexity, be it local, regional or global. A new sinology is not based on old theories. It is about engaging with a re-emergent China. It says that China should not simply be viewed as a threat, nor should this new sinology be based on a reticence towards speaking honestly or critically about today's China for fear of causing offence. Instead, we seek a new balance, one that goes beyond old Cold War concepts of Fanhua or Qinhua, that is, of being either anti-China or pro-China, as if we are eternally locked into some binary world. This is about a more sophisticated way of understanding today's China, a new sinology capable of opening up new ways of understanding this great and ancient civilization and what it might offer again for the future of the world. The challenge for us is how we move forward to promote a deeper, textured understanding of the China of the 21st century, both a China that encourages us all, as well as a China that from time to time causes us to ask ourselves where China is going. In April of 2008, when speaking at Peking University, I talked about Australia's evolving relationship with China and the maturing of our friendship in this new era. At that time I said, in the modern globalised world, we are all connected not only by politics and economics, but also in the air that we breathe. A true friend who is one who can be called a zhengyou. That is, a partner who can see beyond immediate benefit to the broader and firm basis for continuing, profound and sincere friendship. In other words, a true friendship which offers unflinching advice and counsels restraint, to engage in principled dialogue about matters of contention. It is the kind of friendship that I know is treasured in China's own political tradition. The bedrock of this true friendship is trust and commitment. I believe that since the Whitlam Labor government normalised relations with the People's Republic in 1972, Australia has established and built on such trust. A long-term nation-to-nation relationship evolves on the basis of shared interests and mutual benefit. It should also grow and prosper in an atmosphere of increasing respect, deepening understanding and a recognition of values. I've spoken of zhengyou because I feel we need to be able to speak to the government of China, its media and its people in a frank manner. I believe that those engaged with the Chinese world will be respected and should be respected, both for what they bring materially to the relationship, but also what they represent in their own right. In Australia, we are an open society. The consensus by which we govern ourselves is forged through political conflict, conversation and conciliation, all resolved through the ballot box. We in politics live in the scrimmage of media exposure, and we have various tiers of democratically elected government. Like our colleagues in China, we are conditioned by our history, answerable to our environment and constrained by our realities. For us in Australia, our history, our values and our alliances are part of who we are. Our commitment to a positive, forward-looking and mutually beneficial relationship with the People's Republic and the Chinese world has been tested and proven over time. We believe that it is on that basis that we can progress. I do not think that every time we express ourselves on the basis of our values and beliefs, that the core friendship towards China should somehow be called into question. I would question a view that regards honesty and well-intentioned comment as being somehow anti-China or fanhua, just as I reject the careless application of the expression un-Australian here at home. I promote the concept instead of zhengyou, so we can develop the language and the demeanour of a more sophisticated way of talking to and about each other. We have long ago moved beyond the Cold War. Again, I'm of the view that the binary language of that era, that is, of simply being either anti-China or pro-China without any form of nuance, also belongs to the past. I believe this is as much an important new principle for the collective West as it is an important principle for China itself. Otherwise, the dialogue among us all will forever be trapped in a frustrating and unproductive cycle of offence, high dudgeon, and mutual recrimination. In the past, the great Chinese writer Lu Xun satirised those writers who tried to sound elevated and self-important by using fashionable foreign expressions, which simply resulted in pretentious and tortured prose. He called it, to use his term, foreign eight-legged essays, yang bagu, referring to the formulaic essays demanded of the imperial examiners in the past, the Baguwen. Back in 1942, Mao, chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, warned his colleagues against creating a new Dang Bagu, or party eight-legged essays, a form of writing that struck a pose merely to intimidate and to obfuscate. Perhaps we too are often caught up in what I would call the eight-legged essays of international relations, the Waijiao Bagu. That is, stereotypical responses to complex realities, simplistic knee-jerk reactions to situations that require a more layered response. In the great Australian philosophical tradition, I would say it's simply time to get over it. Otherwise, our engagement runs the risk of being formalistic and lacking the elements of a mature and genuine relationship that is necessary as we negotiate the shoals of the future. It runs the risk of concealing beneath it a range of tensions, both real and imagined, which cannot be resolved if they are not the subject of substantive discussion. Let us remember that we are now seeing the rise of a new great power alongside the continued, single, existing superpower of the United States. In this context, genuine engagement becomes critically necessary. History is not overburdened with examples of how such transitions in geopolitical and geoeconomic realities have been accommodated peacefully. We need a new way forward, and that is as important both for the Academy and policymakers themselves, as the deliberations of the first, that is the Academy, often shapes the conceptual framework of the second, that is the policy-making fraternity. The same applies for Australia and our own engagement with China. Consider the events over the last year. 2009 brought a number of tensions in our bilateral relationship. First, there was the controversy surrounding the failed Chinalco bid for Rio Tinto in June. Then in July, the Australian-Chinese businessman Stern Hu was arrested in Shanghai. In August, Rabia Kadir visited the Melbourne Film Festival. During those months, our processes, our views, be they official or popular, were frank and forthright. The boisterous environment of our democracy and the media were on display for all to see. We appreciate fully the core concerns of the People's Republic of China, in particular with regard to its territorial integrity. But we too have core interests in Australia and core values that do not change over time. The interests of both of our nations and our peoples must form the basis of the evolving dialogue between us. Australia's engagement with and serious study of China is not a recent phenomenon. It has been a strong part of our heritage, as this lecture series amply demonstrates. But this does not mean that it is yet a strong or rich enough part of our national dialogue. As a country, we, Australia, need a focused training of expertise in 360-degree China literacy. Today I'm announcing how the Australian Government intends to encourage and deepen such China literacy in our principal academic institutions. To develop a new sinology, we must take scholars, experts and policymakers out of their silos of separate academic disciplines and departments. We need to foster a new degree of collaboration and engagement between scholars and practitioners of different backgrounds and different expertise. And to do that, I believe we need to establish a new centre of study, learning and exchange of ideas and understanding. A place where scholars, thinkers and policy specialists can engage in a cross-the-board approach that brings history, culture, literature, philosophy and cultural studies, and those perspectives into active engagement with those working on public policy, the environment, social change, economics, trade, foreign policy, defence policy, and strategic analysis. I think that it would be good to bring all these silos together, the classical disciplines merging together with the great tradition of civilisational studies. I can think of no better place than the Australian National University to further the sophisticated research and dialogue on China's engagement with Australia, our region, and globally. Nationally and internationally, the Australian National University is uniquely placed to build on its China-related expertise through a vibrant, sustainable program of integrated research, education, training and public engagement, as well as its valuable library, resources accumulated over the decades going back to C.P. Fitzgerald's time. Therefore, it's with great pleasure that today I announce the establishment of the Australian Centre on China in the World, or as we will call it in Chinese, 中华全球研究中心. The Australian Centre on China in the World will enhance the ANU's existing capabilities to create an integrated, world-leading institution for Chinese studies. The Centre will be a hub for national and international scholars. It will also be linked virtually with other university centres, both at home and abroad, which carry related expertise. The Australian Government's aspiration is simple. It is to make this centre the preeminent global institution for the integrated understanding of contemporary China in all of its dimensions, and for the study of contemporary China's regional and global engagement. In Australia, we have a deep national interest in becoming the unparalleled repository of this expertise. I have said before, part of our nation's mission statement is to become the most China-literate country in the collective West. This is one step in that direction. But there is also, I believe, a wider global interest in this being the case, given our long-standing links with European, American and Chinese scholarship in this area. In short, the government's intention is to build over time the global go-to place for the analysis of the continued rise of China in all of its complexity, domestic and international, employing an integrated and multidisciplinary approach. It will conduct leading-edge and innovative research on China, developing new generations of scholars with deep expertise in China and building awareness, both within Australia and internationally, of China and its role in the world. And we look forward also to engaging through the Centre with counterpart bodies in China itself. Involving outstanding thinkers and researchers in China, our region, North America and Europe is the key to this new Centre's brief. Through this initiative, we will help foster and support future generations of intellectual, cultural and political leadership and provide new and creative research opportunities and training. We will also expect that the business and philanthropic community will see the value of this centre and contribute to the foundation that will support it in partnership with the government's initial and significant investment. This initiative is to be far more than just a resource for government and academics. A new building will also be designed to house the centre, which will be both a modern academic centre and a focal point for the university itself. The Australian Centre on China in the World will foster research and educational links with other Australian institutions and increase our national capacity to provide research, outreach, postgraduate and other training activities dedicated to an informed and mature consideration of China. This study of China and the teaching about China is not only about China and the world, it relates profoundly to China in the world. It is about research and thinking about China in the larger context of history, as well as in relation to our Australian world, our region, Asia and the Pacific, as well as in the context of China's multifaceted global engagement. It is about a China that through trade and economics, foreign policy and defence policy, history and culture, ideas and beliefs, language and literature, is part of the major conversation and debate and the major conversations and debates unfolding in the global environment in which we live, think and continue to hope and prosper. It is about a China whose role is crucial whether we talk about economic growth or climate change, regional security or international politics. At the same time, the mentoring of people in the public sector and providing access to a broader community of outstanding scholars, practitioners and the media are crucial to the mission of this new centre. We need not only expand high-level dialogue with China, but we need to do so with its academies, its academics, policymakers and senior business people. We must also seek to enhance understanding of China at all levels of Australian society. And that is part of the mission also of this new centre, to contribute to a well-informed debate that engages the broader Australian population in a dialogue that directly concerns their future, China's future, our region's future. To conclude, In establishing this new centre, we are building on a legacy of decades of Australian scholarship and broader academic, economic, cultural and political engagement with the People's Republic. And that robust engagement must continue with the China of our times, not shying away from controversy, but always seeking deeper knowledge and, where possible, common understanding, and all in a new tradition of a new sinology anchored in the principle of Zhengyou. I thank you.
Well, Prime Minister, Vice-Chancellor, Senator Carr, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Richard Rigby, I run the ANU China Institute, and to me falls the happy task of moving the vote of thanks. It would be churlish and unnecessary to seek to add anything to a speech of the quality that we've just heard, but if you allow me just very briefly to make one or two short observations. The first is that as I heard the Prime Minister go further and deeper into the mysteries and splendours and glories and agonies of China, I did so with a rising sense of concern as I began to realise that here's a man who could take my job. He could indeed take the job of any of the ANU scholars of China, and this is deeply concerning. However, as I also follow the domestic media with as great interest as I do reading People's Daily, I did actually remind myself that here is a man who already has a very good job and has no interest whatsoever in abandoning it in any time soon. Having said that, though, I think what we have seen, amongst many other things, is the example of the sort of person, the sort of graduate the ANU can produce. And I think the Vice-Chancellor and Jeremy and others who have played a role in this wonderful production can certainly take a bow. For myself, and the Prime Minister again has provided me with the segue into making this point by referring to his time as a young diplomat in Beijing in the mid-80s. In the mid-80s, I myself was not quite so young diplomat in London. And in 1986, Bob Hawke, as Prime Minister, was visiting China, and he said he wanted me to go with him as his interpreter, because I'd performed this function, to his satisfaction at least, with a number of other senior Chinese visits to Australia. So I arrived in Beijing a couple of days before Hawke was due to arrive, and I was met at the airport by a young embassy officer who handed me my briefs, and I took them. I went to the hotel, deposited my luggage, went to the embassy, to have lunch with the number 2 at the embassy there, who's now head of a very important and significant Australian government agency. That person said to me, so what did you make of Kevin? And I said, who's Kevin? He said, the bloke who gave you the briefs. So I said, that smart young fellow at the airport. I did actually say that. Smart young fellow at the airport. And I said yes, and David said, now I've given his name away, you mark my words, within 10 years we shall both be working for him. Now, he was actually out by a few years due to the ineluctable mysteries of the electorate, but his fundamental point remains, and I must say it gave me great pleasure as a public servant and now as a member of this great academy to continue to work for such a Prime Minister. I think nothing would give Morrison, if his spirit hovers, as I'm sure it does over this assembly today, nothing would give him greater pleasure than to know that in Australia now we have such a degree of interest and expertise and focus on China. We have elected a Prime Minister who understands the importance of China to us and to our future, and a Prime Minister who has made the announcement that has just been made. As I say, for Morrison, who did so much 100 years ago to try to bring Australia into a greater understanding of the realities of the world in which we belong, I think indeed Morrison would be a very, very happy man And of course, all of us here at the ANU today are very, very happy people indeed. I'll say no more, but just ask you again to express your thanks to the Prime Minister.